Hello there, my name is Jessie and I am an animal artist. Today I'm going to draw and paint a blue throat bird. I'm using a 2B pencil and I am also going to be using watercolours. So I've just got a sea white sketchbook as well. So what I would recommend first is to study the image you're using as a reference and check the proportion of the birds and try to remember and learn as you're going through looking at the picture, the different sizes, how big is the wing relative to the head, and just so when you're drawing you've got an idea, because you don't want to get to a point when you start painting and you realize, hang on a minute, the wing is like really big in comparison to the head. How did I not see that? So study the image before you start to draw it. When you're studying as well, try and pick out some simple shapes, so circles, triangles, semicircles, and then once you've got all that information, you can start drawing. So I started with the head first and drew a circle, and then from that, the triangular shaped wing, and then I built the belly and joined it all together, and then I added on the tail. Once you've got those simple shapes, and you can adjust and tweak the outline as you go as well, because the circle you draw for the head initially won't be perfect. You might need to rub it out and adjust slightly because the bird's head isn't perfectly circular. And then once you're happy with the outline, start adding the details. So on the wing here, I'm just adding in the feathers. On the belly, I'm also outlining the pattern because they've got a beautiful pattern on their chest. So I'm just drawing some guidelines to help me pinpoint where that pattern is. I'm also around the edges, I'm sometimes adding in a little bit of fluff just to make it look more fluffy. And you can see here I've changed the wing length. I've made it a little bit longer and pointier. So adjust when you need to and then get ready to paint. So I'm going to start off by using a wet on wet technique. So I used clean water on a round brush and I applied it to the bird. And then I put some cerulean blue onto that water and it should diffuse out. Same here, I applied some water first and then I put some, I think that's burnt amber, onto the chest. Again, fresh water and then a darker blue there, ultramarine most likely. And then you try not to interfere and just let the colours blend naturally out. Also here, I wanted to make just next to the beak a little bit darker, so I just added a darker blue to that part of the bird, and because it's quite watery underneath the eye still, I can just add pigments and allow the natural blend to take place. And when it starts to dry, it looks really beautiful. So that's just some simple wet on wet technique. So fresh clean water and then add the pigments. And you can see on the chest, the pigments are starting to blend and mix slightly and it's producing a really beautiful effect. I'm also going to use a wet and dry technique, which is what I'm doing now. So that's simply I'm putting watery paint onto a dry surface. So here I believe I mixed ultramarine with burnt sienna to make a nice grey colour, and then I'm just applying that to the back of the bird. For the tail, I used those colours, ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I added a tiny bit of dioxazine purple because there's a slight purple tint to this bird. And then I'm using the wet and dry technique, just adding in those details. Now I'm using that grey I made and add a little bit of burnt amber to it to give it more of a brown tint, adding it to the eye and the wings. Now for the belly, I'm going to add some clean water and then I'm going to add in my grey I made with a little bit of ochre yellow and a little bit of burnt amber. And I tilt the paper up to allow the paint, the pigment to spread down to move across, because you should try your best not to interfere with a wet and wet technique. But one really good way, just to help the pigment move, is to tilt the paper slightly to allow the pigment to move down the water, and it produces such a beautiful effect. So from this point onwards, I do use a lot of wet on dry. And it's wet and dry is great for controlling marks. So the wet and dry technique helps to maintain like crisp, sharp edges, which is great for adding detail, because sometimes we can overwork a piece with a wet and wet technique and you just need to add in some fine detail, and the wet and dry technique is great for that. So it's basically less water and more pigment, and the brush strokes are just a lot more controlled. So when holding a brush, make sure you have a nice grip, a firm grip with it. Hold the brush towards the end if you want looser strokes, or hold the brush closer to the tip if you want more firm and solid brush strokes. And you can use the side of the brush for thicker lines and marks as well. So here I'm just using my grey just to add in some detail around. This is all wet on dry, so the the layer is dry, so now I'm just adding wet paint onto the dry surface. And another thing to keep in mind is, well, there's two things really: softening edges and tone. Let's talk about softening edges first. So with the wet and dry technique, you're going to apply some crisp, sharp edges, which is sometimes what you want, but a lot of the times we do need to soften those edges. So you've got your crisp lines, it looks good, but we just need to soften the edges ever so slightly. So with a clean brush, you just gently go over those edges and just soften the edges ever so slightly. Now with tone, I want this obviously to look three-dimensional. This bird is flat. It's not actually three-dimensional. It's on a flat bit of paper. The bird is flat, but I can make it 3D by manipulating the tones. So as you'll see, around the edge of the bird it's slightly darker, so that's because that part would be in theory further away from you, so it appears darker, and underneath the belly it's slightly darker as well. So keeping in mind tone is really important, and also direction of the feathers. So when studying your image, you should be looking at the feathers. What direction are they moving in? Are they all in the same direction, or do they slightly change direction? So keeping that in mind as well. For the small brush that I use in this painting, the black brush, it's a 3/0, and I tend to use those small brushes a lot. I actually got those brushes from Amazon. They're quite cheap, so you can get a bunch of those. They're really, really good. Just make sure you clean them properly after use, because if you don't clean your brushes properly, they just get messed up and you have to throw them away. So yeah, after you've painted, I would rinse your brushes underneath some warm water. For the legs, I'm just adding in some detail as well. I'm using my grey that I made just to outline the legs, but I am leaving a slight highlight in the middle. Again, that creates some tone. If it's dark on the edge and then lighter in the middle, it looks almost three-dimensional. So just keep in mind with the tone as well. Um, Tone is so important. If you can't get the tone right, it's not going to look three-dimensional and therefore not very realistic. So, and it's quite difficult to create tone with paint. It's a lot easier when you're doing it with pencil, but so I would practice tone um to help produce more realistic looking artwork, and that's just simply creating darker colors into lighter colors. So the darker the color, the more pigmented it will be. The lighter the color, the more diluted it will be. And here you can see I'm adding in the darker areas to help create that tone, to help create that contrast. And also, if you think about it, the lighter the light source, whether it be artificial or the sun, the more dramatic the tones will be. So if the light is quite bright, the dark shadow areas are going to be quite dark and dramatic, and the light areas will be a lot lighter. So in this case, I do have a slight dramatic tone because my dark areas are quite dark. But yeah, so that's it. That's the blue fruit bird. Stunning bird, absolutely stunning. First time I painted it. Never seen one before. Hopefully I will one day. I hope you found that useful. And yeah, thanks for being here with me. Bye.